where was the French saying fraternity, equality, liberté, whether it's Germans giving permission for Jews to live outside of a ghetto and so on. When Jews began to live a more free life and not confined to a mental ghetto as well as a physical ghetto, they began to see beauty in the world around them. They began to see music, architecture, study philosophy, literature, mechanics, technology of that age, medicine. And they were attracted to those disciplines. But in those days, entry into the university, certainly for a professorship, but even as a student, entry into the guilds, entry into the world of literature, entry into the acceptance meant also becoming Christian. Because all that beauty was coming out of the church. The paintings, the music, the architecture. It was all connected one with the church. And so if you wanted to be a part of that world, you either had to or you wanted to convert to Christianity. And it was happening in significant numbers from younger people. Several brilliant rabbis who were willing to, who would not close their eyes to this, decided to face the challenge by pointing to the fact that the things that you young Jews find attractive is not the Christian doctrine, it's their architecture, the music, their paintings, their literature, their philosophies, studies. Judaism doesn't prohibit that. You want to, you are amazed at the beautiful churches that you see here in Europe? We will build synagogues that look like those churches. You are impressed that the German pastor or priest speaks in German with a great orator? We will train rabbis to speak in German, or French, or other languages that were common in Central Europe, and we will take upon ourselves the culture of Christianity, of the Christian world, but we will retain the principle of Judaism, which is there is a God, that God is good, that God is just, that God is compassionate, merciful, kind, etc., etc. That's our principle of faith. Christianity believes that that's not enough. To emulate this God in being a good person is not enough. You have to accept the principle, the belief, that that God rejected, saw that that wasn't working, and instead decided to come down on earth as a human being through his only Son and to die on the cross to save us from our sins. You can have the beautiful architecture, the beautiful music, and all the literature, and all of the philosophy. You don't have to accept that principle. And Reform Judaism was born. They were reforming Judaism. And when it was carried to the United States, it was dominated by German rabbis who imported it to America. And they wanted to fit into the American world, and they went a step further. They also dismissed basic fundamental Jewish practices as well as Jewish garb. And what did they do? Eliminated the laws that they believed were particular to the culture of the Jewish people from ancient times. They said, you don't have to keep kosher anymore. Kosher food, prohibition against pork and bacon and things like that, not mixing milk and dairy, that's part of the Jewish culture. We are German in culture or American in culture. That's no longer necessary. It is no longer necessary for us to have our day of rest on Saturday. It's easier here in America to have it on Sunday. So they had their main services on Sunday. And why do you have to have a handwritten scroll with words from the Bible in the synagogue? We now have printing. So they began to build synagogue with no art and no Torah scrolls. And that became what's known as classical reform. In the United States, in the late 1800s, there was a substantial community of Jews who didn't come from Europe in the 1820s and 1830s, primarily from Germany. They came from Holland in 1654. They had gone to Holland from being expelled from Spain and Portugal. They are the Sephardic Jews. And they came to the United States very early. And they felt themselves American, and they lived Jewish lives. And when they saw the reform coming, at first they said, yes, we should make some changes. We should make some changes. We can build big, beautiful synagogues and have great music and so on. But you Reform Jews, you Reform rabbis are going too far by throwing out the baby with the bathwater. You are deleting the fundamental practice of being a Jew that keeps us united as a people. We have remained here in the United States since 1654. What keeps us American is that we dress like Americans and we talk like Americans and so on. But what keeps us Jewish is that we have certain parameters. And therefore, they announced to the Reform, we are rejecting the majority of the extremism of your Reform. We want to conserve the tradition. And they formed a new element that came from the United States called conservative Judaism. Now the word conservative in English, I don't know how to say it in Lithuanian, but it's a very dangerous, thank you for being here. You don't have to apologize, I'm glad you were here. The word conservative means, it's come to mean right-wing, Republican, against any gun control laws, against abortion, against etc. A right-wing, not a nationalist, but a little of that too, but a conservative or right-wing position in politics and so on. The conservative movement is actually liberal, democratic, and all that sort of thing, and in favor of gun control and pro-choice and so on. But they still have that name, conservative, because their goal was to conserve the tradition. So they kept the Jewish dietary laws of Kashrut, they kept the laws of the Shabbat, they kept the laws of ritual prayer, they kept the laws of having a Torah scroll in the Ark, they kept the laws of having Shabbats on a Saturday, not on Sunday, and they conserved the tradition. And so in America we had three movements. The Reform, which got a foothold first, the Conservative, which was a response to them, and then the wave of Eastern European and Russian Orthodox Jews from Stepluk in Europe, who represented the Orthodox movement, or Orthodox Judaism. It didn't take long before the conservative movement grew tremendously. Tremendously. It grew from the fact that the Jews who had come from Eastern Europe and so on, who had come to America, were not just running away from pogroms, they were also running to something. Not just away, they were running to something. What were they running to? A good life. The Golden Medina. They wanted things to be good. They wanted them to have better opportunity, more education, more wealth, and more comfort and more safety. And Orthodoxy seemed to them culturally to too backward. It was living in the old world of Europe. The conservative, the Reform, was like a church. It was like Christianity without Jesus. The conservative was exactly what they felt most comfortable with. It was a modern form of Orthodox without that strict set of beliefs, and things could change, and they began to live after the Second World War. Jewish soldiers came back, they got benefits from the government, they bought homes in suburbs. You couldn't walk to the synagogue, they wanted to drive, the Orthodox said no, and the conservative movement mushroomed tremendously. 15, 20 years later, one of the leading professors at the conservative movement's rabbinical school, that's where I went, by the name of Mordechai Kaplan, said the conservative movement has accepted changes, but then they stopped changing. They have become very fixed in their ways. They're as fixed in their ways as the Orthodox are in theirs, or the Reform are in theirs. And he said, we have to start living with a different understanding of the basic principles of Judaism, primarily about God, and primarily about the principles that we've always accepted, such as the Jews are the chosen people. God shows us as different and more precious than any other nation on earth. Kaplan said, outmoded. That's absurd. It is still imagining God like the Orthodox. Some man with a beard as long as David's over here, but all white, of course, who's deciding, oh, I love you, like a father figure. I love all my children, but I love you best. I'm going to be extra deep. Here, I'm going to give everyone a piece of candy. I'm giving you 2 pieces of candy. This is God? This is modern thinking. This is people who studied philosophy. He said we have to reconstruct Judaism and make further changes. And those changes were resisted because of the Holocaust. Because so many Jews were lost who represented traditional Judaism, there was a fear in that conservative movement of changing too rapidly. And there were others who were afraid that changing too rapidly or changing basic ideas would make them too close to Reform. And so they wanted to stay where they were. And so Kaplan began a new movement called Reconstructionist Judaism. And he wanted to change many of the prayers in the prayer book. And he wanted to change our concept of God, that God is not a being, a person-like figure, but God is a force for redemption, a power for salvation. In other words, he was talking in the abstract. God is an abstract. God is not a noun that is a thing, that you could measure it and so on. God is an abstract. And he found, interestingly enough, support from the Hasidic movement, because some of the great Hasidic rabbis had ideas like that, and Kabbalists, who were mystics, had ideas like that. One example, the best example maybe, is the Kotzker Rebbe, who said to his students, where does God live? They said, what kind of a question is that? God lives everywhere. And he says, no. God lives only where we, people, let God in. God is in your house, not by opening the door and there's air. God's in your house if you live a life that's kind and thoughtful and loving and good and compassionate. If you are mean and nasty and selfish and rejecting, no matter how kosher you are with your food and how much you shake the lulav and the etrog on the holidays and how long you fast on Yom Kippur, God is not in your house. What kind of a concept is that? He also was saying that God is an abstract. And Kabbalists, mystics, who had a different approach, to trying to, who saw God as love. And they saw sex as an act of love, an act of God. It's a godly act because it brings two people closer together. So the Reconstructionists began to, that was appealing to them. And they developed a movement that now is the smallest of the Orthodox, conservative, reform Reconstructionists. But it's the one that was most challenging or most creative. But what happened? The same thing that happened to the Orthodox that created Reform, the same thing that happened to the Reform that created Conservative, the same that happened to the Conservative created Reconstructionist. It became fixed. And then developed a new movement called Renewal, Jewish Renewal. Very new. One of its, probably the key founder, was a young man who grew up in the Hasidic world, in the Lubavitch world of Chabad, where there's a tremendous love for Jewish people. His name was Zalman Schachter. David Shegezedi knows about it. Zalman Schachter died just recently in Boulder, Colorado. Always looked like a rabbi, not like me. Always had a beard, always, he had that look, a prophetic look. And he lived an orthoprax life. Notice that word, orthoprax. What does that mean? Orthodox is why you think. Orthoprax is how you practice. So he lived a life of being very meticulous with the commandments, but not because he believed that things can't be changed. In fact, he was of a stature where he was ordaining people to be rabbis if they studied with him or with people he appointed, and he began to ordain women. So he was one of the starters of a movement called the Jewish Renewal Movement, where they blended what was missing with the Reconstructionists was that it was all intellectual. Kaplan was a brilliant intellectual philosopher, and he was, what should we say, sterile. It was all in books. And what was missing was the joy and the passion and the love that comes with being happy to be Jewish. And that gave birth to the Renewal Movement. And the Renewal Movement began to take Jewish practices and give it new meaning. It was renewing the joy in Judaism. Gave it new meaning in ways like, for example, they would gather together to celebrate a holiday, and they would bring in, as Zalman Schachter did too, through respect for other religious traditions, particularly Eastern religions, they would bring in very nouveau, cutting-edge things that were happening in the spiritual element of the society. And they would gather for a conference, when we went to a conference in my movement, you had a book, and this is the program, 8 to 9, 4 choices. This is in that room, that's in this room, this is in this room. Break for this, 6-minute break, and then I went to the conference of the Jewish Renewal Movement. 9 o'clock, we're all gathering on the grass. We start off in a big circle. Everybody's together. We start off in a big circle. The first thing you do is you hug your neighbor, this side and this side. And then you tell them what's the most important thing in your life. And then total strangers. You get connected. And then you sing together. And then you have the person who's speaking, speak. And they can't speak too long because you have to break for another hug and so on. And they added to Jewish expressions and Jewish rituals, they added a personal component. Really, it took Judaism, made it a two-way street. Jewish traditions and rituals were feeding into the individual, but the individual was also feeding back into the tradition. So if someone would say, to me, Yom Kippur, the day of fasting, is not just a day where I don't eat, but it's a day where I cleanse myself of the attributes of my life that I'm not happy with, that I think I offend people with, and so on. And they would write notes, make a note of all the things that you did that you didn't like about yourself. And then they would, would wrap it up, and then they would burn it in a fire. And they weren't worried about whether you were allowed to make a fire on Yom Kippur, or allowed to write. That was secondary. And that's the Jewish renewal movement. Simultaneously, there was another element that was developing that also came out of the conservative movement, but at the same time, but for different reasons, that rejected the corporate organization of Jewish life. Welcome to our synagogue. The dues for membership are $1,000 per year. How many children do you have? The tuition in the school is $800 per child, a discount of 10% for the second child. If you cannot afford it, bring in your tax form to prove that you can't afford it, and you'll meet privately, etc. You would like a seat for the holidays? Well, we don't have seats up front, but we still have 2 seats, so very organizational. The rabbi became a CEO. The cantor had to come from a musical school, and it was very bureaucratic. And this group, coming out of the conservative movement, the most actually the most desirable of the students, they said, we want to start living Jewish life in small groups without bureaucracy. We don't need a rabbi, we're all smart enough, we went to, some of them are rabbis. We want to meet in a home, not in a building where we have to pay a mortgage, etc. We want to meet around the table. We don't want 2,000 people in the synagogue, we want 15, 20 max. And that started the chavurot. Chavurah means a clump of people. A chavurah is a group of friends. And that's how their movement started. And they have been crossing over with the renewal movement. The last movement to tell you about, and then finally I will allow you to have to stop hearing me, is the humanistic group. Humanistic Judaism developed from the Reform and the Reconstructionist. And they said, even the Reform, that have given up kosher food and all sorts of other things like that, they still talk about God as an old man in the sky. I don't believe that. I am a humanist. I'm an atheist. And yet I'm Jewish. You cannot be a Christian and be an atheist, I suppose, because if you don't believe in God, how could you believe that He had a Son who died on the cross to save you from your sins? But as a Jew, I'm a Jew because I'm culturally Jewish. I'm a Jew because I feel bound with the history and the heritage of this people. I'm a Jew because I exalt its values. I'm proud of what Jews have accomplished. But I'm not a Jew because I believe in God. That went out with the creation stories and Adam and Eve. And so, a movement was begun, started with one rabbi, called Humanistic Judaism. You don't have to be an atheist. But you could be an atheist and feel comfortable. And God is not really mentioned in the service. I can't say prayers because they're not prayers anymore. They're more like greetings. But they also observe the holidays and Shabbat and things like that. But without making it mandatory to believe in God. The humanist. So now you have Hasidic from Russia and Ukraine, Yeshiva from Lithuania, Orthodox, Eastern Europe, Conservative from America, Reform started in Germany, Reconstructionist, out and outgrowth of Conservative, the thinking man's form of Judaism. Renewal and Chavarot, the warm and fuzzy expression of Judaism. And humanistic Judaism that says we are culturally Jewish, we're bound together by history and heritage, but God is not essential. With that, I probably should have stopped a half hour ago, but with that, I rest my case, and I hope that you have learned something from that. And okay, so I'll talk some more if there's a reason for it, but let's start with where we are now.
Thank you.
Do the new humanistic ones today have education programs for the young?
Good question. The humanistic Jews generally don't have their own education programs for children because they're a very small movement. And when there's a humanistic synagogue, the people come from all the way around because they want to be in that group. But it's easily traveling to bring the children 2, 3, 4 times a week. So the children are educated in Reform, mostly. And then there's a new phenomenon that's developing, and that is giving children a Jewish experience through summer camps and trips to Israel, and when it comes to what they have to know for bar mitzvah, having them taught by somebody hired for that exclusive responsibility. That's happening in the humanistic movement. It's happening in Reform. It's happening in Conservative. It's happening. Any other comments? It doesn't have to be a question. It can also be a point of view. Maybe you'll even tell me a little bit about yourselves. I have no idea why you're here or what you're doing in Vilnius and why you came tonight. So, yeah.
Thank you so much. That was a wonderful, wonderful talk. I agree with everything you said. I just wanted to add something about the Jewish culture in Vilna before the war that had once a big movement in America but doesn't anymore. In Vilna, there was no Reform or Conservative. There was only what we would today call Orthodox, although with different shades and even some Lithuanian Hasidim like Karlin and Chabad.
Yes, actually, Rimas took me to. Oh, I was in Kalmus, to the Hasidic synagogue, which surprised me.
The Hasidic Armenian, very many, but they were Lithuanian Hasidim, very different. But there was a very important minority that defined themselves as secular Jews, and they would have been very offended to be left out. Many of them attended synagogue once, twice, 5 times, or even more a year, and many of the old secular Jews from Vilna, Warsaw, Kiev, throughout Eastern Europe, would have the attitude, if I go once a year, it has to be a real shul, an Orthodox shul, because I want to experience what my forefathers experienced, whatever I believe. Now, that secular movement, the secular Yiddishist movement with its dozens of subcategories, was once very big in America. It had up to a dozen daily Yiddish newspapers in New York City, ranging from Zionist to far left. And I think, especially in this part of the world, it's very important to see that it developed differently, with secularism developing with various attitudes toward religion, but no reform, no conservative, no chavurot, no reconstructionist. Although Mordechai Kaplan, whom you mentioned, we are proud, was born not far from here in Sventsian. Sventsian is 45 miles to the north of here.
Really? Yeah. What town?
Sventsian in Yiddish, and Sventsian today. And Sventsian.
Yes, that's a very good point that you made. And certainly anybody's giving a talk about the spectrum of religious identification in Lithuania, or anywhere in Europe. Poland also would have been true. Would have to account for that. As a matter of fact, as Dahlia and I were walking here to the library through the old Jewish town, I asked her to what percentage of Jews in Vilnius were non-Orthodox. I know that there were frum and there was secular. Was the secular community small? Was it tiny? Was it half? What was it? And what she said to me was, she didn't know the figures, but she also knew what their ideology is. Most likely communist.
Leftist, but most were anti-communist. That again, everything looks different from outside. From here in Vilna, the Bundists, the territorialists, the anarchists, the social democrats, they hated Zionism and communism equally. They believed that their non-communist democratic socialism, which meant staying where you are. It was an anti-migration movement, known in Yiddish as Deutsch.
I didn't mean to imply that all the secular Jews were...
No, but here in Vilna there was 1% of the
socialist movement.
So, and because communism was illegal here in the Polish Republic or in Kaunas Kovna in the Lithuanian Republic, there were no communist newspapers. There were a few hundred illegal Jewish communists in both cities. Okay. But it was their enemy stereotype that they're all communists.
So let's take that for a moment and transport it to America. Because there was that very significant element of Yiddishists, Bundists, etc., communists, socialists, etc., in the United States were anti-religious and in most cases, or many cases, anti-Zionist before the Holocaust. Okay. Where are they today? Here, they were put to death. Where are they today in America?
They collapsed entirely because they failed to pass it on to their kids, and it was a total and miserable failure of transmission. But they left 10,000 great works of literature and other things that are part of the history, and a small interest today.
That's my point. Yeah. It's important to hear that. The Orthodox in America from the late 1800s are still in America. The conservatives that founded there, they're still in America. The Reform, not only still in America, but most people, not most, 35% in the study said that they identify as Reform. It's misleading, I'll tell you that in a moment why it's misleading, but they're healthy and they're vibrant. The Reconstructionist movement is growing actually, the renewal movement is growing. The humanist movement is too soon to tell. But where are the descendants of the totally secular Jews? And David is correct. They collapsed. They disappeared. Meaning what? They assimilated. Because wanting to save the world is very much of a Jewish value. But without the things that identify you as Jewish, you lose you lose that sense of community, that boundary. So one of the big problems with philanthropists in the United States, Jewish philanthropists, who are not particularly religious or even affiliated with synagogues and movements, is that they have taught their children that being a Jew means being a good person. And that's why they said, I give to Israel, and I give to Jewish hospitals, and I give to Jewish this, I give to Jewish that. Their children listened more carefully than their parents realized, and their children are giving the money, now that they inherited it, to save the whales, and save the dolphins, or all sorts of charities and needs that are not connected at all to the Jewish community. And with it, the people that they're meeting are non-Jews of the same social caliber, and because they have a humanist approach, they're saying, well, I'm Jewish, you're Catholic, we're getting married, let's have a priest and a rabbi. Let's have Hanukkah and Christmas. And the children of those unions are one step away from even forgetting that they have a Jewish heritage. So the reason that it didn't last here, although the Nazis treated them all alike, is what's happening there. And that's the danger of reform. And I'm glad you mentioned it, because it gives me a chance to add that what we're seeing in the reform movement is a recapture